Hi, everyone, and thank you for making the time to join us today. I'm Sam Wendel. I'm Senior Research Analyst at Monitor, and I'm very excited to be hosting our session today on how the U.S.-Israel-Iran war is reshaping energy markets. And so we're having this conversation, as we were approaching the 90-day mark in the conflict and its corresponding disruption of oil and gas flows through the Strait of Hormuz. And, with each passing week, the fallout from this historic supply shock continues growing as many observers fear we're kind of reaching a tipping point in terms of market resiliency. Barely a day kind of goes by without this conflict delivering a new market moving headline. And, even just, I think today, US President Trump said that negotiations with Iran are in their final stages while warning again of fresh attacks. Yeah, feels like we've been here before. But I would say, at the 3 month mark, it's safe to say that, the question is really no longer whether or not markets can absorb a shock like this, but whether or not we are sort of witnessing a permanent rewiring of global energy security, maritime trade, and Gulf geopolitics. And so, with me to tackle this topic is a really excellent group of experts today. Please join me in welcoming Carole Nakhle, the CEO of Crystol Energy and Secretary General of the Arab Energy Club. Thank you for being here. Kristian Ulrichsen, Fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute and Co-Director of the Middle East Energy Roundtable. Thank you, Kristian. And finally, Noam Raydan, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where she writes extensively on topics related to energy and maritime risks in the Middle East. And so before we launch in, just a quick reminder, this is an hour-long webinar, and we will be taking questions from the audience tuning in. So please put them in the chat, and I will do my best to weave them into the conversation as quickly as I can. But beyond that, let's launch right in. And Carole, I wanted to open the discussion with you. You've kind of argued recently that we are entering, a new normal for energy markets. And I wanted to get your read on kind of where we are at the 90-day mark. I mean, I think last I checked today, Brent crude futures were at about $106 a barrel, well below the highs seen last month. But, many observers are warning of sort of reaching a genuine tipping point as supply shortages become critical. When it comes to market resilience, what indicators are you watching, most closely in this phase of the conflict? And, what permanent changes do you think are already underway?
Thank you very much. I'd like to start from your reference to something I said recently about markets entering a new phase of new normal. And it's just because it's a statement of facts, because historically, if you look at developments and major changes in energy markets, they often, if not always, took place after major crises hitting either supply or demand. So it would be very naive to believe that once this conflict is over, we're going to go back to exactly the same conditions as before. Now, mind you, some of these changes may not appear immediately, but they will take time, but they are definitely in the making. But others are already with us. We don't have, for example, now for the first time in its history, the UAE is not anymore an OPEC member. So that is already a new phase in energy markets. The whole Middle East geopolitical situation and the relationship between the key players in the Middle East and their neighbors, and also the way they now go to reassess the vulnerability or resilience of their infrastructure, all these are going to take an extra sense of urgency going forward, and that will have repercussions on global energy markets and global supplies. And mind you, while the whole world is focusing on what is going to happen in a few hours or tomorrow, energy markets are complex and they do evolve, and they are usually, we look at them primarily from a long-term perspective and not from these kind of day-to-day variations. And this is something we should remind ourselves of when we are thinking about where we're heading to next. Now, to answer the second part of your question, on these kind of changes in prices and where we are today and how people are expecting a major drama in the summer, I don't subscribe to these kind of warnings, because throughout my career, I have not been able to find somebody who can tell me exactly on which day there will be a serious shortage of a certain fuel. Already we saw, for example, some expectations only a month ago about Europe, for example, running out of jet fuels within 6 weeks from, let's say, April. We're already over that period. And actually, you know what? All airlines are saying there's plenty of jet fuel. So what we shouldn't underestimate here is the ability of markets to adjust to the kind of price signals that we are seeing. We shouldn't forget that we started this conflict in a situation where we already had lots of supply in the market and lots of cushion. And we shouldn't forget also the power of demand to adjust. And often that tends to be underestimated. So you put all these together and you can have an idea that, yes, now we are on a roller coaster. But mind you, I have the feeling that prices, yes, they are, when there are some threats coming from Washington, they are increasing. But actually, the opposite reaction, whereas there are rumors about potential detentes, the drop is much more significant than the increase. So we will be on a roller coaster, not a symmetrical roller coaster, but we have to be really more cautious and more humble when we are making predictions of some disasters or jumping off the cliff on a certain date over, let's say, the summer period.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great, Carol. And Kristian, I want to kind of jump in a little bit on what Carol just said in terms of the UAE's exit from OPEC, because I mean this was obviously a major headline that I think caught a lot of people off guard, but for observers such as yourself, this was not really a shock. This is something that has been underway for quite some time. But I think it would be useful to kind of get your view on how you see this conflict sort of impacting the old Gulf energy order led by Saudi Arabia, and what this moment reveals about the deeper shifts underway inside the Gulf.
Thank you. Yes, the I think the surprise was more one of timing. Why was it on that specific day rather than the fact that OPEC or the UAE had decided to withdraw from OPEC? This had been something that wasn't unexpected. We had seen splits between the UAE and Saudi Arabia at meetings in 2020. In July 2021, there was quite a public spat between the UAE and Saudi positions. In 2022, when the Saudi-Russian oil output cut was announced, the UAE was quite active in signaling that this was nothing to do with them. They were distancing themselves from that decision. So in a sense, the question was more one of why at the end of April. And it's interesting, for example, that in 2018, when Qatar chose to withdraw from OPEC, they gave a month's notice. The UAE gave 3 days, and it was effectively we're leaving on Friday, on the Tuesday, and that was it. And actually, the way they left very decisively, very quick, reminded me of the way they normalized with Israel, with the Abraham Accord announcement in 2020, a decisive move signaling that historical kind of regional relationships didn't maybe hold as much value for the UAE going forward into the 2020s, a willingness to break with a regional consensus, in that case with the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, in this case with obviously OPEC dominated by Saudi Arabia. The UAE wants to monetize its oil reserves faster. The plan to increase capacity to 5 million was taken in 2016, actually the year that OPEC Plus came onto the scene. The UAE is very close to actually getting to that 5 million capacity target. So this was a moment I think they felt in Abu Dhabi that they could leave, but obviously at a time of such disruption to energy markets that it wouldn't happen overnight, that they would suddenly flood the market with an extra 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. But effectively putting people on notice that if and when we do get back to whatever form of new normality we see, that this will happen. Obviously, it's reflective of also wider issues. There have been persistent reports of tension between Saudi Arabia and the UAE over the past several years. The issues in Yemen at the end of 2025, when we saw UAE-backed groups in southern Yemen really overstep the mark in terms of threatening what the Saudis saw as their sphere of influence, and then the Saudis really pushing back very hard. It was a backdrop, the fact that the Emiratis announced the decision to leave OPEC the day that Saudi Arabia was hosting a GCC meeting to discuss the unprecedented events was obviously probably uncoincidental and would have, I suspect, been seen by the Saudis as a provocation. Having said that, I suspect for the moment at least, the Saudis and Emiratis will be able to contain many of the differences, at least for the moment. We've seen Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh and Mohammed bin Zayed speaking at least 4 times, I think, since the war began. And I expect that they'll manage to contain any potential geopolitical splits, at least for the moment. Whether that changes post-war, if the UAE decides to increase production very quickly, the Saudis decide to do something differently, try to prop up oil prices to generate the revenues to get to that last phase of Vision 2030, that's when we could see divisions. But for the moment, I think that's not something that is going to be happening anytime soon.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. That's I think helpful considering some of the takes out there. And now, Noam, I want to turn to you. I think this year it's become safe to say that the Strait of Hormuz has become a household, topic, or people now are finally kind of aware of this. But you've been studying this for a long time, and you recently kind of described how Iran has quickly, established a new navigational order in Gulf waters, and has been showing it can control its maritime domain in ways that observers didn't necessarily predict. I was hoping you could kind of, excuse me, walk us through how Iran has kind of defied expectations to implement this new navigational order and kind of what this means in practice for global energy markets and maritime security.
Hi, Sam. So yeah, as you said, way back, even in March, I made sure to write a piece 2 weeks into the war, and I warned against what Iran was doing. They immediately moved to establish themselves as the principal controller of traffic. For me, at least, I did not expect them to do that. I thought they would actually continue focusing on a tactic they used for several years against commercial shipping on the maritime domain, and that was ship attacks. They did not. They actually used two things. They made sure to immediately move into the strait, issue threats to ships and prevent them from moving. By doing that, they made sure that this would actually have ripple effects throughout all the global oil and gas value chain. And by that, I mean the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream, regionally and globally. And the global ripple effects of Iran's action in the Strait of Hormuz back then, they were predictable and quantifiable. In addition to taking control of transit, Iran also ensured to continue attacking ships. But again, this tactic, attacking ships, is not what Iran really relied on, knowing that it was very effective for the Houthis back then in the Red Sea during their maritime campaign. And both we have the Houthis and Iran, unfortunately, both of them have established new navigational orders in the region. And I said in another piece, I do not expect these to return back to normal anytime soon. And or even if there is an agreement, political agreement in the region. And if you don't mind, I want to just quickly share the maritime attacks map, which we have created and used, and which frankly continues to drive our analysis at the Washington Institute. Let me know, please, if you can see it right now. So that audience, everyone who's watching, really understands what I'm talking about. What you see over here, these are not just merely dots. We're talking about hundreds of events that took place since 2017 up until now in the Red Sea, Northern Red Sea, Southern Red Sea, in the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, and also here in the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran not only this year started attacking ships. They've used this tactics for several years, as I said, in order to retaliate either against U.S. sanctions, for instance, and let me just quickly let me take you back only to 2012. As you can see, even up to 2022, we were seeing Iran attacking ships related to its shadow war with Israel, like Mercer Street here, Tyndall. If you click on it, you can read everything that Iran did in this region, and specifically why it targeted this Israeli linked ship. They also, as I said earlier, they attacked ships linked to U.S. sanctions, or in order to force some countries to unfreeze some assets, Iranian assets in their banks, and which were related to U.S. sanctions. And now let me just stop sharing it and move to my final point. The final point here I want to say is that I really expect Iran to continue projecting this influence in the maritime domain right now. So we have proof from several years how they used it. Now we've seen how they even maximized this power they have on the maritime domain. Now, because we have a U.S. blockade, I expect that Iran will continue to justify its control of transit in the Strait of Hormuz by saying that due to what they call quote unquote security threats nearby, they need to maintain their presence and influence and control of transit in the Strait of Hormuz. And I do not see them letting go of this leverage, which is the strongest leverage they have amid the negotiations that are taking place with the United States. Given this situation, how are others behaving? Again, I warned about it in March. Countries are reaching out to Iran to cut side deals with Iran. We have in the region, we have Iraq, we have India, which relies on Middle Eastern oil producer and exporters, specifically in the Persian Gulf, Iraq and Saudi Arabia for crude oil. We have Japan, we have South Korea, we have Pakistan, and probably others, in my opinion, will reach out because they will continue relying on this region for energy security. India is one of the importers that I would keep a close eye on. Today, we saw some reports saying that India is willing to send ships to load from the Persian Gulf. 2 days ago, in my Substack newsletter, I said watch out for India because it will continue relying on Middle Eastern crude. Knowing that India, by the way, for those who don't know, had to start importing more Russian crude thanks to US waiver that allowed them to substitute some of the flows they could not get out of the Persian Gulf, specifically from Iraq, which unfortunately had to just freeze some of its export via the Strait of Hormuz. And I'll leave it at there, Sam, and I'm happy to take any follow-up questions.
Yeah, you've covered a lot of ground there, I think, and we will circle back on some of this, but we've already got a couple of questions from the audience. I think we'll start with this one, with, Tehran rejecting, with Tehran, refusing to give up control of Hormuz. I mean, what options does the GCC have, to get around this new reality without emboldening Iran? And, Noam, I think you just mentioned that a little bit about some of these sort of bilateral deals, but Kristian or Carole, would either of you have thoughts on that question?
Who would you like to go first?
How about you?
Okay, fine. Look, I don't know honestly how the situation is going to evolve, but I'm thinking when I hear the discussion about Iran and their control of the Strait of Hormuz, of course, it's projecting a certain image of power because that's their main leverage. I mean, the proxies that they were using in the region, they have been weakened quite substantially. Thinking of Hezbollah, thinking even of their allies in Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And even internally, they had some problems. So the main leverage that they have at the moment is this control over the Strait of Hormuz. And they are doing it quite relatively cheaply because they are using very cheap methods to cause such a major disruption everywhere around the world. So I bet you wherever you go around the world, people now know where the Strait of Hormuz is. However, we should not forget that Iran is also suffering from this. So there is a major economic cost attached to Iran. And I don't know, I don't have the exact figure. Nobody knows really what's going on inside Iran. But mind you, it's an industry which has been suffering, like the oil and gas industry has been deprived of significant international capital. So we cannot compare, for example, Iranian oil and gas fields like the oil fields in Saudi Arabia or the gas fields in Qatar, for example. These fields always require a continuous injection of capital. So at some point, when they run out of storage, when they run out of spaces to get the oil out of those fields, they will be forced to shut down those fields. And technically, because of the situation in Iran and this history of lack of investment in the maintenance of those fields, I think restarting production is going not to be that easy for Iran, assuming this kind of standoff lasts very long. And at the moment, they are also being deprived of important source of revenues when prices are high. And also their conventional clients and customers are not that happy with the situation in the Middle East. So when you look at what's happening, you can see that Iran actually, of course, they are using this as a leverage, but I wouldn't be surprised if they wouldn't want to have a resolution to the situation without necessarily giving up a lot of these important cards. Now, that is a bit so that's the economic rationale, but it does not mean that the regime itself is frail or fragile and is going to collapse anytime. I think the Iranian regime was built to resist. And I think that's what we are seeing today, that can last in this situation for a a long time. And I believe that the countries in the region realize that. What they are doing about it, of course, there is the political and the diplomacy channel. That is a different story. But from an energy perspective, some countries have already prepared for some of that scenarios. I hardly hear people acknowledging what the Saudis are doing through their East White pipeline to the Red Sea, and they are diverting almost 7 million barrels a day. The Emiratis are diverting a big chunk of their exports around the Strait of Hormuz, and they announced recently a replica pipeline to double that export capacity. So countries in the region today, and I think the crisis is going to create more solidarity among some players there, thinking about how can we protect ourselves from these kind of scenarios in the future. So that could be something, a positive outcome. But at the moment, nobody knows what will happen. But really, I think the Middle Eastern political map is being rewritten after that, because I doubt the relationship between the neighbors, especially between Iran and the Arab countries that were attacked without being involved in this war to start with, is not going to be the same. I think if there was a tiny bit of trust that took time to build, I think that trust was being seriously broken.
Yeah, if I could just add briefly on the GCC, I think as both Carole and Noam have said, I mean, one of the things to watch going forward is that this has had such a different impact among the six states, because obviously we have Kuwait wholly reliant on the Strait of Hormuz for its oil exports, Qatar wholly reliant on LNG, Abu Dhabi as well from Das Island, completely reliant on the Strait for LNG. So we see some states which lack the workarounds that Carole has mentioned, and of course Abu Dhabi is accelerating plans for the second pipeline, which will link it to the offshore fields as well as the onshore fields. So they will have greater resiliency built in as of 2027 for any future crisis. But for the moment, it would not surprise me in the least, as Noam has said, if we do see countries that are completely locked in right now doing these side deals. We saw, I think, Qatar with Pakistan and sending out 2 LNG carriers. Then the Pakistani side, I think, had negotiated passage with the Iranians. We see, I think, today there are reports that Iraq is sending several tankers out of the Gulf, or trying to, and again, after a lot of negotiation with Iran to ensure safe passage. And just one other thing in that respect, obviously we talked a lot about, we've seen a lot of people talking about the new normal with the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, but this also will carry implications for other waterways, other straits around the world. If Iran succeeds in establishing or overturning, or at least upending decades of customary international law about innocent passage, this will have potential repercussions for the South China Sea, even for European waterways. It's not something that can be contained in the Strait of Hormuz. If it can be shown that a state that adjuts a waterway, which is an international strait, can just simply impose fees and effectively create this new normality, what's to stop others from trying to do it as well? So I think this is also why one of the longer term impacts of this will be so important to watch, because since 1949 there has been the right of innocent passage with the Corfu Channel case. And so international law is being tested to the point of potential kind of evaporation, at least for the moment.
Yeah, those are all really excellent points from both of you. Thank you. And we have another question kind of linked to that, and it's one that I'm seeing a lot in general, is about this newfound interest in bypassing, the Strait of Hormuz with pipelines. And obviously, as Carole mentioned, the UAE just announced or last week announced it was fast tracking new pipelines. But this is actually something that we've discussed, Noam, about how there was a lot of hype around the pipelines, but it's not really a magic bullet for, reducing maritime risk. We can't really avoid that. And I wanted to kind of weave you in on the conversation here and sort of, understand how what you think people need to be watching with regard to efforts to bypass the strait, and, how this impacts maritime risk in the future.
Yeah, another good question, Sam. I've continued focusing on the issue of maritime security. That cannot be ignored. Unfortunately, the solution for the Red Sea crisis wasn't easy. And the Houthis still managed to establish a navigational order there. And the reason why I say that is because every single day I monitor ships. Basically, ships are the first thing like I check in the morning. Up until now, in the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, I look at the behavior of the ships. Even if the Houthis are not doing anything, they're still signaling using their AIS, to signal. They have quote unquote no links to Israel. They are Chinese, they are Russian, and the Houthis are not doing anything. But the shipping industry is still cognizant of the threat there, and this is considered. This is not. This is what the Houthis managed to achieve by not doing anything. They're actually still able to project themselves as a threat in the region. Moving forward, maritime security will remain the main issue, even if, let's say, new pipelines are built, right? I showed the map earlier, and it shows you that Iran used drones and even just boats to attack ships. Loading, anywhere close to in the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and they can reach them. So a pipeline cannot be portrayed as the solution. Without maritime security, without finding ways to try to see how we can reverse the damage Iran has done. It has upended the principle of freedom of navigation and basically upended all the traditional arrangements, maritime arrangement in the Strait of Hormuz. If these questions are not seriously addressed by regional and also global players, because you have global markets that will continue relying on the Middle East for their energy security, then we're gonna make sure that we continue repeating the same mistakes and allowing state actors like Iran and even non-state actors like the Houthis and probably others in the future, who knows, to use the maritime domain as a theater of operations during conflicts and during crises. So yes, it's very important to think about pipelines. It is very important to think about more contingency plans and finding ways to bypass, ways to move some volumes using the alternative routes, but we cannot say, yeah, we can just stop relying on the Strait of Hormuz like that. It doesn't make sense. The Strait of Hormuz will continue to be a very important and critical choke point for not only energy markets, but even like for container ships, bulk carriers. And we know that some regional players have maritime ambitions. They want to become logistics hubs. You cannot do that without maritime security in the Red Sea and also in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waterways. And I hope my answer is clear. And I'm happy to have follow-up questions.
No, that's really great. And I think sort of a follow-up, I think that I have on this, perhaps for you, Carole, is that, when we're talking about, pipelines and, kind of reshifting investment priorities or, diversification because of this and, how, when we look at how this crisis is impacting Gulf states in different ways, I mean, how do you see the trajectory of this conflict impacting the way Gulf states think about their energy security and diversification and sort of investment priorities?
Thank you. Before I address, I just want to, because it's interesting what Noam was saying about maritime security. It's definitely a new chapter in the kind of risk that we are facing, but I don't think it's new. I mean, all along, any kind of trade route, I'm thinking about the pirates in the past, not the current pirates, but anyway, the current kind of pirates are also risks. I think it will always be there. It has acquired perhaps a new model, a new style with major repercussions on any ship, passing through certain straits or elsewhere. And now with drones and the evolution of technology that has created a new kind of risk. But that's part of international trade and the kind of the long list of risks that we are facing today. Now, going to your question on on investment priority in the GCC, for them, when you think about energy security, it's not the same definition as when we talk about energy security here in Europe, for example, because Europe is a major importing region, and when you think about energy security, it's primarily the security of supply. In the GCC today, I think the energy security, which used to be traditionally the security of demand, because they are exporters, they do have the demand is out there, but they are unable to get all their oil out of the region. So that creates a new layer of the energy security dimension for the region. And this is where we go back to the importance of not only diversifying your infrastructure and your export route, but there is one issue which is really quite controversial when you think about the region. If you look at the map of the region and the infrastructure, energy infrastructure, the pipeline, the interregional pipeline connections, there is hardly any. I mean, even for gas, imagine you have some of the largest gas reserves in the world and the biggest exporters of LNG. And it's not an insignificant region when it comes to the production and consumption of gas. And yet the interconnection between countries is pretty modest. There's only one small, short pipeline. So there could be a shift here in the region in terms of improving the collaboration, even between countries where trust is not the same. For example, Iraq and Kuwait, Iraq now and Syria and other countries, just to diversify this kind of export route. So that can answer one dimension of energy security. Now, the other element, which we cannot, deny in terms of its importance, but I would say it's less important and relevant for, in terms of the crisis, is of course diversifying your energy mix, which was on the region's agenda before the war and it's unlikely to be ditched. However, the recent attack on or near the nuclear facility, nuclear power plant in the UAE, I think it's going to be a setback for plans of the scale when it comes to nuclear power. So maybe I can see the trajectory, because before the war, nuclear power, we could see that the UAE is the only Arab country that has nuclear power plant. And other countries were thinking, okay, that's a very tempting proposition. And the Emiratis did it very fast. Yes, it came with at a very high price tag, but maybe we could replicate it. And I think today that might be a setback for plans for nuclear power. But for other projects such as solar or whatever, green energy, it's not like they are going to ditch those plans. They are going to stick to them, but I wouldn't say that is the priority today because of energy security concern. The energy security for the region is getting their oil and gas out to markets, because energy security in that respect is economic security also for the region.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I think, Kristian, I want to sort of follow on that a little bit and kind of looping a little bit back to, the UAE as an independent producer element of this story. I mean, when you see and we look to the future, in a post-conflict scenario here, how do you see the dynamic with the UAE as an independent producer, kind of bucking Saudi-led coordination in the region? What are the biggest risks or opportunities facing the UAE in sort of a new energy order? And how do you sort of see this conflict more broadly shaping, energy cooperation outside of Gulf producers?
We obviously don't know yet what degree the UAE post-crisis, whenever that may come, will coordinate or will at least align with OPEC and OPEC plus, or will they just go flat out to try to get to 5 million as soon as they can, which could be 27, 28. So I think there are still some unknowns as to how fast they will go, whether they will decide that if there's a move to obviously replenish stocks that have been disrupted, does that crash prices? How does that play out in Saudi Arabia? Does the UAE just go all out straight away? So I think there's still a few unknowns. Obviously, the pipeline has been discussed. The second pipeline will give them added resiliency. However, as we've seen over the past 2.5 months, Fujairah has been attacked repeatedly. We've seen attacks by drones on oil storage facilities. So it's not a fail-safe option. The UAE also in 2023 made a decision to build out a big new expansion of its own LNG liquefaction capacity, and they cited that it was originally supposed to be in Fujairah, and they've chosen 2023 to actually put it at Ruwais for greater synergy with existing facilities. And Ruwais, of course, is in the Gulf, so the UAE's LNG capacity expansion will also be potentially vulnerable to future shut-ins, future disruption too. So I guess the short answer to the question is it's still very uncertain how the UAE will do this. They want to obviously forestall any potential long-term shift away from oil in the 2030s, 2040s, get the oil reserves out now while they still have value, convert into capital they can invest. We've seen huge investments by the UAE in the US recently, continuing actually post February 28th. The UAE also wants to become self-sufficient in gas, both associated gas, we increase oil production, you increase gas production, and also in non-associated gas at several of the fields there. So they have big plans to try to, continue to diversify the economy, but using the resources they have, which are oil and gas for now, to accelerate that. I think we also may see individual Gulf states, as we have seen over the past 2 months and in the past, also increasingly investing in upstream facilities around the world. And obviously, I'm speaking to you from Texas, and Qatar recently just, they exported their first LNG cargo from Golden Pass, which obviously is a long-term project, hasn't, obviously been developed as a result of this conflict. But right now, it gives the Qataris at least some degree of ability to continue to produce. And we've seen other, I think, Emirati and Qatari and potentially also Saudi investments as well, which I think will pick up, and potentially also investing in more storage agreements outside the Gulf, in Asia especially, which, as others have said, has been particularly hard hit by the current crisis because Asian states are so dependent on oil and gas from the region, from the Gulf, including Iraq and Iran. So I think those are also long-term projects that we'll probably see an acceleration of going forward.
That's great. And I want to return potentially briefly in a second to some of the clean energy momentum question, because that is also something we're seeing a lot of interest in. But real quickly, I wanted to touch on the sort of LNG question, and I think I'll direct this to you, Carole. But one thing early in the war that I think that became apparent to some observers was that the crude risks had been sort of, had been well sort of, or people had been tracking that for quite some time, but people were kind of shocked by the LNG outages from Qatar. And I'm wondering how, looking ahead in this new normal, how this sort of reshapes risks around LNG, and does this impact the way Gulf states diversify I mean, for example, referencing the Golden Pass investment and other interest in U.S. LNG, and even ADNOC's interest in Santos in Australia last year. I mean, do you see this impacting or how do you see this impacting and reshaping interest in LNG globally?
I'm glad you raised this question because, first of all, I think, yes, it was a shock to the system when we saw not only that Qatar could not send its ships, its tankers across Hormuz, but also its facilities were attacked. And that's why, anyway, we saw the jump in prices, around that period compared to the beginning of the year. But when you zoom out a bit and take a much longer perspective, so if you look at prices, let's say from 2019 until today, we are at a fraction of the levels that we saw in 2022. So yes, there was a jump in LNG, but not really the crisis of the same scale that we saw when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Now, why? Of course, Qatar is a very important player, accounting for almost let's say just above 20% of global LNG exports, and there's a huge concentration of exports of LNG compared to oil. So if you look at the top three for LNG, they are the US, Qatar, and Australia. They account together for around 60% of global LNG exports, and that is by itself should make us be concerned, because whenever you have this kind of huge dependence and concentration, then you are exposed to a major risk and volatility if one of those producers is affected, and that's what happened. However, LNG or gas markets are not like oil markets, because if you look at the share of gas that the gas produced that is traded, it's very, very small, less than 30%. And only just above half of that share is traded in the form of LNG. So in the bigger picture, the disruption of, let's say, what's coming in the Middle East is small on a global scale. And also in terms of gas markets as a whole, not just LNG. and also the kind of disruption to Qatar that is not going to come back on stream before a few years at 17% is less than 4% of total LNG capacity. And we also have other LNG coming on stream elsewhere. So this is how the market realized that yes, we do have a problem, but not really the apocalypse or Armageddon, all these expressions that I heard made by some commentators because of the initial shock. Now, what does this mean in reality for us, as market observers and for investment in the future is, again, we think about diversity, but there is one reality we have to accept. As gas markets globalize, as in the case with oil, we have to accept volatility comes with it, especially that when you have more LNG traded in spot markets and you still have that kind of concentration that I mentioned earlier. So volatility is a norm. We're going to have to accept it. But at the same time, we should also see, I wouldn't say a shift away from LNG or gas altogether. The beauty of gas is that you can easily substitute it, as we saw in Asia, for example, because gas has a substitute in each of its application. But what I'm seeing around the world is this, what you mentioned, Sam, in terms of, and this is not new, this has been going on for a while. Even the Qataris, they had investment in US LNG for ages because they were at the beginning planning to export LNG to the US, but then after the shale revolution, they converted their terminal into an exporting facility. So they already had footprints around the world. But for a trip I did recently to Asia, what I saw there is that not that they are going to ditch LNG altogether, but they are going to focus even more so on their domestic resources of gas, because there is no shortage of domestic resources of gas, but there is more interest. So this kind of dynamic picture that we are seeing on gas and on investment, and we should expect it to continue. I think for LNG, the train has already left the station, but we should expect the market to continue to evolve. And with that evolution, risk and volatility will come along, and our interest in diversifying sources of supply and export routes will also develop along.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. And before we shift gears too much, actually, I wanted to circle back a little bit to you, Noam. You'd also highlighted recently that the war is creating kind of new ways of trading that, as traditional maritime arrangements break down. And I think you alluded to that a little bit with some of the the data points on the visualization. But can you kind of walk us through what you're tracking here, and what it means for energy markets as, I think you brought up the example of an Iraqi tanker to me earlier, but I'm curious, especially because there's been a lot of interest in recent years about, Iran's shadow fleet, for example, and now, in the Gulf waters, we're seeing, GPS spoofing and a lot of interest in, the tracking environment. And I'm wondering how you're seeing this sort of impact at the trading landscape.
Yeah, very good question, Sam. Another good one. Thank you. So yeah, we discussed it earlier. I think today, for me as a ship tracker, I've been doing this since at least 2017. What we're seeing in the region are a lot of dark activities at the moment. It requires a lot of investigation most of the time, specifically between Iraq and Iran, for instance, in the Strait of Hormuz itself, of the UAE within the Persian Gulf. I'm finding myself having to do more work to investigate ships, to try to get the data right. So this is where we are when it comes to data, when it comes to tracking. We're not dealing with a normal situation at all. Every single day, I'm learning something new about how to monitor the ships and assess my observations. But with respect to what I'm watching, here's the thing. As I wrote recently in a piece called The Outliers of the Hormuz Order in my Substack, whenever a traditional order collapses, it neither stays the same. It's going to transform one way or another. And it takes some time to see the new trends or the patterns, but they eventually evolve. I've used my experience in monitoring areas of risks in the past years to apply it to what's happening right now in Hormuz. So take, for instance, the Red Sea. Back there, I kept monitoring all the operators that will continue using the Red Sea despite their Houthi ship attacks. And there were a number of them. But not everyone is willing to navigate a highly volatile region like the Red Sea in the past years. Now, back to Hormuz, the question is, if others are staying away from the region, not willing to trade, who's willing actually to go there, navigate those risks, pick up the cargo, and get out? we have a few players already. We already have one Greek shipping company. This is well known. And the other ones that I tracked and published are actually tankers that used to trade Venezuelan oil, right? So, and this is actually something very interesting for me. And I keep asking myself, who else is willing to return, let's say, from trading Venezuelan oil or even trading in the AOPL, which is the area between Malaysia and Singapore, where you have ship-to-ship transfers that take place, who's actually willing to leave those areas and actually go to the Persian Gulf because they have experience in trading in risky areas, make profit, and get some cargoes out. Already we have, as I said, 3 tankers. I have them published out there if anyone is interested in reading about them. And these actually include one tanker. She was sanctioned in December 2025, and then she was removed from OPEC's SCN list back in March 2026. She used to trade Venezuelan oil, was sanctioned, but now she's not sanctioned. And now she moved to trade in the region, and I'm keeping my eyes on these. The other thing I'm really watching is the following. We're going to see more STS ships within the region, ship-to-ship transfers, meaning some ships, probably VLs, and not sanctioned ones, of course, but very large crude carriers loading within the Persian Gulf and then leaving outside the Persian Gulf to, let's say, transfer it to another ship of Sohar, Oman, or Fujairah, especially to those ships who are unwilling to enter the region. And this is something I'm watching. Also, probably storage terminals. Maybe some countries within the Persian Gulf would store the oil in Oman outside the Persian Gulf along the Gulf of Oman, and other ships will come and pick it from there. So this is what I'm watching right now because, as I said, this system, right, collapsed, but it's transforming gradually, and some trade will continue happening until we find some sort of a new arrangement to how things will move on in the Strait of Hormuz, and depending on the diplomatic, how can I say, the negotiations between the United States and Iran. So I hope I answered your questions. Happy to answer any follow-up, and I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you. We're running a little low on time, so if you have any questions in the audience, please put them in. We have gotten a couple of questions looking at sort of the types of coordination or arrangements we might be or that could emerge to help kind of in this crisis. And maybe this is kind of a question for you, Kristian, as you've long been tracking sort of the broader sort of collaboration or political sort of momentum behind regional coordination here, and especially if you look at perhaps how this crisis is impacting sort of the the implicit U.S. or not implicit, but the U.S. security for energy model of coordination with the region. I mean, do you see that breaking down, and how do you see Gulf states? I mean, what avenues of cooperation do you see emerging to help in this crisis, or to push to end this crisis?
I mean, if you were to be very flippant in responding, you might say there's no security, no energy at the moment, and it's completely broken down. But I mean, obviously, that's just a very flippant remark. But we may see, I mean, obviously, the US has long been seen as a regional security provider in the sense that the Gulf states, since about 1990, since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, have worked with the US, have looked to the US security and defense umbrella to contribute to regional stability and security against, as they saw it, external threats. Iraq in the 1990s, Iran since the 1980s, and others more recently. That is now again being called into question, I would imagine, to different degrees in some of the Gulf capitals where they will see US decisions since February, but also going back to the 2025 12-day war in June last year, that in their view are incomprehensible. They don't seem to take regional security calculations into account, and arguably from some Gulf capitals are now contributing to instability on a scale that we haven't really seen for many years. This is, I think, the first crisis hitting all 6 GCC states at the same time. We've had previous crises affect maybe 1, 2, or 3 at a time, but from a Gulf perspective, this is unprecedented. It's unique. We may see greater coordination among 2 or 3 Gulf states going forward. We talked before about the pipelines and the lack of a real coordinated regional pipeline system. I mean, I remember in the 2000s, for example, there was initially a plan to extend the Dolphin pipeline northwards to Kuwait, not just south to Abu Dhabi and Oman. And on that occasion, it was blocked. It was blocked by the Saudis. So, I mean, Kuwait could really use a pipeline right now, akin to the one that Abu Dhabi has from Qatar for gas. So, will we see greater coordination? Does the situation that we're in now, unblock some of the lack of regional coordination willingness, kind of the intent that we've seen over recent years and decades, to sort of try to rethink some of the policy priorities going forward? The flip side of that is we may just see individual Gulf states doubling down on existing relationships with external partners that drive some of that diverge. Obviously, the UAE and Israel have doubled down and become much more visible in their coordination over the past several years, and including in this crisis. Does that create a divergence, say, from the Saudis or from others in the region? So it could go either way. We could spur greater coordination. On the other hand, it could be greater divergence. And I think too early right now to tell. But this again will be something I think to watch in the medium term, next couple of years as leaders begin to react, absorb the lessons of what has happened, however long it lasts for, and then begin to react longer term.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I'm just going to finish up with a couple of sort of broader questions for each of you on kind of what you're watching or what do you think isn't really being appreciated about this crisis. And I know you've all kind of probably already hinted at it a little bit, but I'm going to start with you, Carole. You've already talked about this new normal a bit and how markets are perhaps underappreciating certain elements or perhaps overhyping certain elements like the jet fuel question. But I mean, what do you think, or in your view, what is the biggest change that markets really need to come to grips with in, a post-Iran war landscape?
Gosh, it's very difficult to really identify one particular change because there are so many forces moving at play at the same time and affecting not only, for example, one source of energy or one country in particular. I think it's a very dynamic situation to pinpoint one change, but I think the LNG question and the gas question would be much more interesting than, for example, what could happen with oil. With oil, I'm not worried. I think there will be at some point, and again, it's based on the data that we have, on what we have seen, the market trends and the market dynamics. There's plenty of oil around. At some point, it's not just about the Middle East. Yes, post-Middle East conflict at the moment, it's not only about the UAE not being within OPEC. And mind you, that has major ramifications because yes, OPEC has dealt with membership changes throughout its existence, but for the UAE, it's a new experience. And other countries are going to be watching very closely how the UAE is going to perform without this kind of connection and maybe either follow or do something different. I don't know. There is Venezuela, right? We all dismiss Venezuela in the short term, but there's plenty of oil there, and that could what can happen later when investments start to come to Venezuela. And mind you, high prices are a good trigger for more investment because capex spending and investment they tend to go, and oil price they tend to move together. There is a question of Russia, so all these also questions that still need to be answered in order to identify what kind of change the market is dealing with. But again, to go back to the major change, I would say on the energy side, the question of gas, the question of LNG is going to be much more interesting to address in the longer term because of this high concentration of supply in three players only. And not only that, the major expansion capacity that was expected to come online in the next few years between now and 2030 was going to be even more concentrated in two countries that are the US and Qatar. So whenever there is high concentration, I get nervous, but does not mean that the market is going to face a huge crisis. But there's also another dimension, the economic dimension. I'm not thinking about just the global economy, the inflation risk, etc. I'm thinking about the Middle Eastern economies, that the kind of diversification that was pursued in the region with a higher reliance on tourism, for example, or other sectors that still relied indirectly on oil money and oil revenues. So that may be an opportunity for us to pause and reflect on the kind of policies adopted in the region, especially when diversifying their economy, because I'm not quite sure it has been done quite correctly. So there is room for improvement. Let's leave it that way.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And then I'm going to turn to you, Noam. Again, you've touched on this, I think, a little bit, but at this point, what maritime or shipping storylines do you think aren't really getting enough attention despite the intense focus on Hormuz?
Yeah, I did not expect this question.
Oh,
uh, Hormuz, I believe I'm keeping my eyes still on Bab el-Mandeb. I'm not letting go of Bab el-Mandeb. The thing is, sometimes you feel because of the way headlines are being shaped, sometimes your attention is being driven, but whatever the headlines are saying and whatever, the opinion is out there. But the Red Sea remains very important. I'm keeping my eyes on Bab el-Mandeb, on the Houthis themselves. I keep watching the Houthis, how they address the Red Sea. In addition, to the work I do on energy and shipping, I also, pay attention to their speeches, to their statements, because this also gives you a sense of how they're looking at it. So this is one. In addition to that, on our map, I think you saw some dots in the Mediterranean. It's interesting that I haven't seen much attention given to it, probably in the shipping industry, yes, but not outside of it. The attacks that have taken place against some tankers that some believe they're linked to Russia. We've seen attacks of Libya, of Malta. We've seen and of Turkey, and we've been tracking them since at least late, I would say, 2024. So this is something I would also watch. How again the maritime domain will continue to be used as a theater of operations by different actors, state and non-state actors, as well as the Arabian Sea. What we're seeing more piracy attacks. Again, I'm not blowing this out of proportion. We've seen them also over the past years, but it's something to also monitor to see how other actors in the region might actually how they might be inspired by what's been going on in Bab el-Mandeb, in Hormuz and surrounding waterways. Asia keeps being mentioned. Of course, it is very important, but I will not get to it here. I'm gonna focus only on what I'm paying close attention to, and yeah, and I believe you did ask something earlier. I think you asked it to Carole. What are people missing or they missed in this whole conflict? I believe it's the sea. It's the sea itself. It's some Up until now, I keep telling people, and the reason why I focus on maritime security whenever also I'm looking at energy is because without a ship, you cannot get so many things you need for your energy infrastructure. And it's very important to continue talking about the issue of maritime security in the region and finding ways to find a solution, gradual solution for it, especially after what happened in Hormuz. And I'll leave it there to give my other colleague time to comment too.
well, thank you. I appreciate it. And finally, Kristian, for you, I have a very similar question, kind of what you think about which second order effects or underappreciated storylines aren't getting enough attention. And I also know that you've obviously authored a bunch of books on very similar Gulf crises in the past. And I'm just kind of wondering how you are kind of comparing this crisis to, recent oil shocks or the Qatar diplomatic blockade and pre-COVID times. I mean, how do you think people are going to look back on this?
I think this one is much greater in magnitude. It's not just a regional crisis. The Gulf crisis over Qatar was effectively an intra-GCC spat, which didn't necessarily have global ramifications, anything like the same degree we have here. So on a kind of global scale, it's totally different. What stays in the Gulf doesn't stay in the Gulf. In this occasion, obviously, it's having knock-on effects on global supply chains. I think a lot of people that looked at the Gulf states maybe as oil and gas, I think, are suddenly realizing post February 28th that actually you have all these other commodities and products, for fertilizers, for aluminum, for sulfur, for all these other products are now also completely disrupted, also reliant on passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Refined production of petrochemicals being also one that are less amenable to the pipeline exports. And so this is, I think, why the current crisis is so multifaceted. It really will get to the heart of these global supply chain shocks. We had COVID, we've had the Russia-Ukraine shock in 2022. This is yet another example. And as others have said, I think we're getting to the point where those initial workarounds are beginning to evaporate. We will begin to see real shocks coming up very soon in terms of physical shortages potentially and feeding into higher prices potentially in the US for was obviously seeing the gasoline, people beginning the driving season next month. Then you have the congressional midterms coming up onto the horizon if prices remain high. So we're getting to the point where some of these changes will really become noticeable in sort of day-to-day life. And again, just finally, as others have said, so far the Houthis and the Bab el-Mandab have remained largely quiet. But were that to change, that would again be a huge shock on the shock, and effectively. And we've seen how quickly the risk of sailing through the Bab el-Mandab was reassessed post February 28th, because even though the attacks from the Houthis had largely died down end of last year, companies weren't still willing to risk that passage until February to the same degree. And so were that to be another choke on the global economy, that would really, I think, be a huge step backwards, but in terms of a huge escalation too.
Well, that is great. And okay, this has been a really excellent conversation, but we've exhausted our time. And we had a bunch of questions from the audience on clean energy and renewables investments. So perhaps that is going to be a topic for a future webinar that you all can stay tuned for. But thank you to all three of our panelists, Noam, Kristian, Carole. Really thank you for the time and the insights. And thank you to the rest of the Al-Monitor team for supporting on this. And of course, thank you to the audience. And we encourage you, if you aren't already, to consider subscribing to Al-Monitor. But that is all from me. And thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Yep.